Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Dr. Vic, and you're listening to the Wellness Path Podcast. I'm excited to have you back on. In today's episode, I want to talk about something that I've been seeing a ton of and in my own practice, and I've been seeing it just in conversations, and I know it's getting more popular because I hear moms bringing this conversation up with me about this particular thing when it comes to mouth breathing, tongue position, and so much more. And I want to get into why this is a quiet epidemic that's happening in kids today and in society in general. I'm hearing more about kids snoring, and we've been seeing that more, but we see it in adults too. And it's one of the things that sometimes we think it's kind of cute when you see a little baby, a toddler with their mouth open and sleeping. And one of those kind of the visual red flags that I see when it comes to this, you'll see a kid with like dark circles on their eyes. That's one of the big things. Some people call them like allergic shiners. The other thing is an apnoid face. And then you get from that point, if they keep conditioning it, they'll have weak lips so they can't even close their mouth as well. And there's a reason behind that. Okay. In today's episode, we're going to dive into something that's missed even more. And I work with specialists who do this kind of work, and the ones that I try to educate them on, well, what's the reason why we're seeing it? You know, let's get to that point, because it's great that we're seeing something of it, but we need to understand why we're seeing it. And we're going to go through all that. And then what are things that you can do for your child if you do notice that, if they have a weak tongue, not positioned properly, and so much more. Let's dive into a little bit of anatomy so that way we can just understand the positioning of everything. So one of the things about the tongue is it is known as the internal architect, right? It is truly designed that when we look at, if we just, and I'm not bashing it anyway, but breastfeeding is not just powerful for nutrients for your baby. Breastfeeding is massive for tongue function, oral, teeth, dental structure of the cranium, the skull itself. And it's one of those things that when a baby's breastfeeding, we call it the hard palate, it's the roof of the mouth. Even if a child has a narrow and or high palate, if they breastfeed continually over and over and over, it's soft, it's malleable at this point. It's a hard palate, but it can move, it can change. And you can get kids to where they have narrow palates, and if they breastfeed properly for a long period of time, at least a year, it will help with the structure to widen it to where it should be. That is one of the biggest things when we look at just from a breastfeeding perspective. I mean, the more research I do in the breastfeeding, the more it just makes more sense. And I already understand it from a nutrition standpoint, and an instant shift and change in nutrition while they're breastfeeding. Also a communication system for mom, body, and brain to know how their baby's doing and what are the needs and demands that they do change on the spot if it's needed. So that's pretty cool in itself. But then there's a second layer of that too now. I've been doing a ton of research into the oral function of it all. Where were we before? And then where were like Native Americans before? And it was just like, for me, the way my mind works is when I keep hearing patterns of this, that I'm like, there's a reason behind it, what we're missing. And I've come to 2 points of it. And one's breastfeeding, where there's a not breastfeeding possibly as long. That plays a role in that. But the second is it can get into the neurological wiring. Okay. This is where my world comes in. Because you'll look at things known as the nerve that controls the tongue. So your nerves, you have 12 cranial nerves. What this means is they're actually nerves that come off the brain. Okay. And they go through the skull and they access to different areas. There's one that is an exception. Cranial nerve 12, known as the hypoglossal. So hypo means below glossal throat. So it's the nerve that controls the tongue. Right? It's connected to the brainstem. Now, when we look at this from a chiropractic standpoint, there's a few ways I look at this. Now, when we look at it from a chiropractic standpoint, where does that nerve come from? Where does it come out of the brain? What hole does it come through? And it's going to be the occiput. That's the bone behind the head. How that positions, how it's shifted, how it's rotated may play a role in the function of the tongue, suckle reflex, and so much more. And so this is a huge thing. This is why I always try to work with lactation consultants, because if they have or just moms in general, if you're having a latch issue, there's 2 people you should see immediately. Chiropractor who is trained in cranial pediatric kind of work, primitive reflex work. And then the second is a lactation consultant, because you want to look at it. It's always nerve and then muscles, right? Nerve and then muscles. And that's the way I look at it when it comes to a physical therapist. right? And somebody will say, hey, well, why don't I go see a PT? Go see a PT. They work on the muscles. Or if I'm working with a mom and they're looking at pelvic floor and they say, I should go see a pelvic floor specialist. Yeah, you should get chiropractic care though too, because 90% of the nerves that control the pelvic floor 90% of what controls the pelvic floor is the autonomic nervous system, right? It's a nervous system that runs on its own. So yeah, you can go to a pelvic floor therapist, you might solve 10% of it. But if you go to a chiropractor who understands this stuff and work on the neurology of it all, shift that and then work with that, you're maximizing your results and happening them faster. I literally just had a pregnant patient tell me yesterday how she noticed from the adjustment, next day she saw a pelvic floor therapist, and she was already like, I'm worlds better than where I was. And I think I'm on the right track here. That's absolutely, you're hitting both at the same time. Another thing is nasal versus mouth breathing, okay? The role of nitric oxide, this is produced in your sinuses. I might even get in today's topic about nitric oxide. It's a whole nother podcast. But it creates vasodilation and brain oxygenation. So it allows the brain to get the proper oxygen. This is critical because your brain is beyond what we could ever imagine. We don't even only understand 10 to 15% of it. I mean, 10 is what I knew in school. 15, maybe I'm hoping we're there now. But the long story short, nitric oxide plays a huge role on the immune system. Huge role. We understand this now, and there's new research coming out about this. Nitric oxide is phenomenal for your heart, especially as you age and get older. You want more nitric oxide because it's going to help expand the vasodilation. I had sleep apnea, probably still do. I think I don't anymore. And the reason why I say it like that is because I've done some testing to look at my oxygen levels just throughout the day. And it always worried me because I was at like 93, 95. As a chiropractor, when I do this kind of work, I want to see someone at 99 or 100, no excuse. And so here's me, 93, 95. And I find out that I have sleep apnea, moderate, just barely into that. And so I had to make a choice, either get an appliance to push my jaw forward more, which is something that I'm probably still going to do. But at the same token, I was like, well, what can I do now structurally to change that? And that's when I started looking at other metrics. And I've done some nasal stuff. I do a technique where we expand the nasal passages and airway, and we work on the cranium with that. Long story short, I was testing it just driving. I was on my way home. I have a pulse ox in my car. I'm like, let's see what my oxygen levels are. I'm breathing normal. I could breathe clear through my nose. And I go to check and it's 98, 99. It was 98 and then went up to 99. And I'm not even forcing air in. I was like, cool. I could tell just from an energy standpoint. Now, why am I sharing all this with you? It's critically important that you get nitric oxide in, because if you're not getting that in properly to the immune system, it stresses other things. And I believe this is one of the reasons why we're seeing kids who get bigger tonsils, they have adenoids that get bigger, because you're stressing now other parts of the body, and it's got to take up the load of work now because of that. Because you have to understand, your nose has all these hairs. It's a massive filter system. So it filters out air, so it doesn't stress it. But the brain is very smart. So if you're under a state of stress and you have an imbalance in your nervous system, what I see all the time with kids now, then your potential to lead, the brain's going to say, guess what? We're not getting the proper nitric oxide, brain oxygenation that we need. So we're going to go to quantity rather than quality. Nasal breathing is high quality air, high quality oxygen, if you want to think of it that way. Mouth breathing isn't. So the brain just says, hey, we need to go into survival, so let's just go ahead and start breathing through the mouth. We can get more oxygen. We can pull more air in, and we'll be able to use that to get oxygen to the brain and to the body and what it needs, okay? So that's one of the things. But when we get into, let's get into that why, right? Because I'm seeing a lot more parents talk about this. I guess I work with people on this. So one of the biggest factors, it is the number one, and I won't say number one, number two thing that causes this, because we know now that from the moment of conception to birth, that whole process, where's mom, where's dad, where's the emotions of life, where's all these different factors, they're creating imprints on the child's developing nervous system. And a child develops afterwards, but when they're in the womb, these are called imprints. They play a huge role. Then the birth process is what sets the stage. 99% of the time, there's going to be some imbalance in the neck, and we know that's going to affect it. We know that we're seeing moms that are having more fast labors. We're seeing moms that have more prolonged labors. Cranial molding. This is where your child, if you go through a vaginal birth, they should have the cone head. We want the cone head. The cone head is critical for a lot of things because the bones are designed, the skull is designed to be compressed from the outside in because it'll overlap The bones overlap on purpose. It's a beautiful design. And then there comes a point when a baby's out, they call it the cranium. We call it the cranium bloom, which is like an internal pressure gauge that expands out, and it bloom makes the head start to become more round. And it's critical for respiratory health. That's why children who are born C-section usually have a higher incidence of allergies or respiratory issues because they don't get that. And so I've seen it so many times over and over. But the factor is too, is that when we're looking at there, it affects the skull. And then we have if you have any birth trauma, so a prolonged labor, you got forceps, a vacuum, a C-section, it affects something called the sphenobaselar synchondrosis. Now, this is just a connection. So sphenoid bone is behind the eye, which is one of the critical. It's the keystone of the skull. I work on this a lot with kids. So we got the sphenoid bone, and then we have the occiput bone in the back of the head. Those two are vital, and it affects it in many ways. So if the sphenoid gets shifted, it affects every single bone in the skull and face because it's interconnected in every single way. So this becomes an issue, right? The second thing we're going to have that we see often is going to be, let me take a step back before I get to this. So when we have these cranial stuff that's going on, there's also a stress load that's going to happen. And I'm going to get into that neurological cascade. So as much as I want to jump in now, I'm just going to take a step back here. Let me get to the next phase. The next one can be tethered oral tissue known as TOTS, which is your tongue and lip ties and buccal ties and things like that. Now, the tongue tie, depending on what's going on. Now, there's many different things. There's some people who just say, "Oh, there's a tongue tie, let's cut it. There's a lip tie, let's cut it." My approach is a little different. It all depends on what's going on. I'm actually doing some more advanced training in this to understand a little bit better of when we should and shouldn't, and what's the purpose behind it, and those things. I'm very well trained in understanding what are the effects of having a tongue and lip tie. What does it do structurally? What does it do neurologically? Because it does play a role neurologically. It can make the nervous system a little more oversensory, sensitive issues. It can affect, there's a whole plethora of things what it can do. But for this episode, I just want to share that these are some of the reasons why we'll see that. It could be because if you have an anterior tongue tie, you can't lift your tongue up properly. All right. If you have a posterior tongue tie, going back and forth becomes an issue. If there's specific lip ties that are happening, again, there's a suction issue that could be happening. If you got a narrow palate or a high palate or narrow and high palate for the kiddo, those can mimic tongue ties too. So there's all these variables that come into this, and it's approaching it in a certain way and looking at it from a systematic approach. The third thing could be ancestral shifts. Now, what this believes is this is like when babies, I'm a big component of Solid Starts. It's a program that you can do, and it tells you how your child should eat. It's not about going mushy first and then going this way. It's about giving them food and letting them develop their gag reflex better and help them develop their jaw, their tongue positioning. Because when they put the food in their mouth, most of the time a baby at 6 months, when you give them food, they're going to push it out. They have a reflex that naturally their tongue will push things out. That's eventually going to break down, and then they'll start to play with the food in their mouth. So it becomes a sensory experience. Now, parents are sometimes like, this is a messy, right? Even if you do the soft food method, it's going to be a mess. It's just going to be a mess. You have to prepare for it. I remember when we put our first daughter through this, it was just like a cleaning up. We had a dog. He was very happy about that episode. We're going through that. My second's going to be going through that next month. And so it's the thing of, though, developing that from a neurosensory perspective, helping them get adapted, stimulating all the different senses on the tongue. There's all this stuff that plays massive role in a feedback system to the brain. Because remember, I said the tongue is not just a muscle; it's a it's a neurological component to the body, and there's other things to it also that things like the fascial lanes. I won't get into too much on there. But coming back to the point of the neurological aspect, getting into not having soft foods and letting them build up because you're not putting stress on the jaw and developing things as well. So this is another factor that we're seeing in modern society that we're shifting to this process, and this is why Solid Starts is. When my wife first shared it with me, anytime she shares anything with me for when it comes to our kids, I always look at it from a neurological lens first. It has to make sense to me neurologically to go forth. And when she was saying we have weaker gag reflexes, our gag reflexes aren't developed. And then when I was thinking about all the sensory input, all the different flavors and senses and all that going on, I was like, let's do it. So those are the three factors. We talked about the birth influence, the birth process, the traumas of birth. We talked about TOTS. So we got the tongue and lip tie, buccal ties, the oral tethers. And then we have also the ancestral shift, how we shifted things in the modern society. Now let's get into my world a little bit. When you have these things go on, it creates a neurological cascade. All right. So what ends up happening these kiddos is they get stuck in sympathetic overdrive. What happens though is when you have birth trauma, this leads to that process. And what it'll do is it makes it harder for the nervous system to get out of that sympathetic stimulus or drive. And even life is being overstimulated and there's a lot more impact coming on there. That is going to keep them in that state. And then their brain adapts so fast that they pattern themselves into that way quickly. That is where mouth breathing keeps the child also in a fight or flight state, because as they're stuck in that sympathetic dominance, and I've seen it with kids as soon as they were born, even 2 to 4 week olds, when we see them after their body has processed through a little bit, been out in the world a little bit. This will lead then to potential mouth breathing and weak tongue. We call it low tone in the nervous system, and low tone can lead to weaknesses in certain areas of the body of muscles and tone, like core, important things, important factors. And one of them's tongue. And what happens in this process, and I want to really emphasize this is why you can try to work the tongue all day long, strengthen and do all those things. But if you have sympathetic overdrive, sympathetic dominance, a gas pedal revving, what ends up happening is you become more of a mouth breather now. Remember I said the brain goes to quantity rather than quality. And so now it's going to breathe in as much air as it possibly can. And what will happen is you're stimulating more of that sympathetic nervous system. So it becomes a snowball effect, and you just keep doing it over and over and over. And you're firing up that fight or flight state. And this becomes only, even like I said, the brain knows this, but the brain has to do its best for the body every single time. This then can potentially lead to the Sleep-ADHD link. There's a link about this that they've been looking at. And they looked at fragmented sleep leads to the prefrontal cortex dysfunctioning. So that will mimic ADHD. Doesn't mean they have it. I'm not a component to say someone has ADHD. I don't like that label. I never had that label given to me, but as I learned all the symptoms and everything, I was definitely that kid. But what I really realized is I had probably more prefrontal cortex dysfunction. Now you may say, what is that? That's the brain, part of your brain right behind your forehead. It's critical. This is what I work on. This is what all chiropractors work on, especially ones that are very specific. We address this. We work at the prefrontal cortex. It allows us to create impulse control and helps us to stay more centered and calm. It allows us to do future planning, executive functions of it. It lowers our stress levels and so much more. And so imagine that for a kid, building that up and having a really strong foundation to a prefrontal cortex. This is why one of the many reasons why I recommend wellness, long lifestyle care when it comes to chiropractic, because from a neurological perspective. The third thing then that this leads to is sensory processing issues, because you're going to have, with a restricted airway, there creates disorganized nervous system. Now they can't get that proper oxygen. So now things are heightened a little bit more. When your sympathetic nervous system's more on overdrive, you become way more sensitive to stimulus. And this is where it kind of leads to that, sleep issue, which can lead to the prefrontal cortex dysfunction, which minimizes mimics ADHD. Well, the sensory processing issue now comes in because now your kid's a little easily overstimulated from the little stimulus, or they go from 0 to 100 and they're just constantly revved. This is where now the nervous system, think about when you're in a very stressed state, imagine you have an argument with your partner, right? Your spouse, and you're aggravated. Would you say that you react a lot easier in that state than you do being calm and relaxed? We're all going to say yes to that. I'm even a component of that. That's the sympathetic nervous system. It heightens our senses, so it makes it easier to react. We're in a survival state. And that's what we see a lot more with kiddos and the effect of that. The other part that we'll see, and I mentioned this earlier, is the immune side, right? So when you have less nasal infiltration, you have you have something called your innate immune system, and it's a non-specific, which means that it'll throw everything in the world at it to take care of it. If we're breathing more through the nose, we have that line of defense that's strong. If we don't, it's weakened. And this is where, like I said, it can lead to then, as it's getting more into the throat and stressing this area more, tonsillitis or just enlarged tonsils, and also more chronic ear infections. This is where this process comes. So I call this neurological cascade, which leads to, sympathetic drive, gas pedal, right? Revving, sleep, ADHD, sensory processing, and immune issue. My concern about the sympathetic overdrive is that the brain will eventually adapt to think this is life and how it has to adapt to. And then there's more work we got to do to break that cycle and pattern down, because it affects brain development. And this is one other thing I see why kids have so many reflexes that are still turned on. It may be primitive or posture. And if you don't know what those are, we have talked about those in the podcast, and you can check those out where I break those down a little bit more. So what are the things that I will look at as a pediatric chiropractor trained more neurologically focused to address this? The first thing I look at when it comes to kids is their skull, first and second bone, and the neck. And I understand this because there's a relationship with something called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is the brake pedal part of the system. It's the parasympathetic nervous system. And what I want to do is start developing it, strengthening it. The vagus nerve does so many different things. It's 90% of the brake pedal system, roughly 80, 75 to 90%, depending who you read. And it's one of those things I want to make sure that we are stimulating from an overall neurological perspective. That's the first thing I'm concerned about. The second thing that we want to look at is the skull itself. And we want to look at how is the skull structured? And then what are the things that we have to do? I do specific cranial work. It's not cranial sacral. And we want to look at that skull to shape it and get it back into an optimal position to help with more cerebral spinal fluid moving, which is known as nutrition for the brain. The other thing we want to get going is better blood flow to the brain. The more symmetrical the brain is, the more those tissues underneath, the brain tissue, can get better circulation in that area, blood flow, and so forth. So the better, more rounded structure helps with that dramatically. Then we have also the cranial sacral aspect. Now, it's not cranial sacral therapy, but we look at dural tension. So this is on your spinal cord and brain, you have like a wrapping. It's like think of it like a saran wrap, and there's 3 layers to it. The last outest layer is called dura mater, means hard mother, and it's a specific type of tissue. Now, when that tissue gets pulled or stretched or turned in any way, it disrupts the function of the spinal cord and brain. When we do cranial sacral work, we're taking the tension off from that to help ease the nervous system and ease the tension on the body, which helps it to be more higher in an adaptive state of functioning to life and stress and so forth. This will also, though, allow for the palate to expand. Now, this is critical because there's so many kids in today's world getting expansions and all these different things. And I try to educate orthodontists as much as I possibly can for those who want to listen, because they're trained that they say that when they expand the palate of they expand the palate, it doesn't affect any cranial bones. And I'm like, it's a gear system. You change one, it affects them all. And if you have one side that's jammed and this side that's loose and you're expanding, you're going to jam up more stuff and create issues for them down the road. And I try to educate as much as I can, where if we can see kids before they have expansions, at least a month or 2 before, we have better success rates. I have kids right now that I've been working with about a month or 2 in, and then they got their expanders. Phenomenal. I had a kid who had an expander that failed, and it happened like right before they started care. And I said, map out at least 2 months. They did. Now, all of a sudden, they put it back in. Little boy's not having any issues, not popping out as fast like it did the last time. He's doing really well with it. And so this is where, if you can have proper cranial sacral integration, less dural tension, it allows for the expansion. So that we can create better success for kids when it comes to needing expansion if they are in that state. The last is restoring vagal tone, which is just going to be that nervous system I said earlier. But this is what's we want to shift that nervous system. And this is all the work that I do for adults and for kids, is how to shift them from a sympathetic dominant state and get them more into a parasympathetic, which is their growth and development, which is critical, which is very important for a kid. But also, it's your self-healing and self-regulating mechanisms. Yes, you can self-heal and your body self-regulates all the time. And if you're in a sympathetic overdrive, you're not healing and you're not regulating properly. If you stay in that state over a long period as an adult or as a child, symptoms are going to show up eventually. And it's different for everybody. I have a simple test that I do. It's a neurological evaluation in my office. It's the most simplest test that I can think of. And one of my mentors does it, and that's where I took it from, is that it will tell me how much sympathetic overdrive are you in, because how much you can't do a specific, balancing thing on there. So it really is that kind of a thing where we look at this approach. And I have other things I look at depending on the child's age and other things. We have other neurological stuff that I can do to combine it with everything to help them as much as possible shift their tongue and mouth breathing to get them to be there. And and then I refer out if I need to for that to be evaluated, to see what are we working with and what we need to do. So when we look at this overall, it's a whole collaborative response. And this is why I love working with orthofacial myologists, because and dentists who are very specific on airway, because then I know that if I'm working with a kid who has low tone, weak tongue, mouth breathing, and all these things, I say, great, guess what? Go get evaluated by so-and-so. This is the one that I recommend the most. And I know you're in good hands and I don't have to worry about anything. And I can just stay in my lane. And they already understand what I do. And that's where we can go ahead and keep doing that. And I'm going to be interviewing I'm going to try to get a series in on this with an oral-fascial myologist that I work with. That way, we can share with you guys a lot more and go more in depth about this stuff. So this is just a good teaser, a good intro to the stuff that we'll be going over. Again, some people say, well, how do you know this works and what can be that? I know this does. I have a 9-month-old that I've been working with, and weak tongue, did not roof the mouth breathing. Mom was like, can chiropractic help? And I said, well, first we got to get the nervous system in check. Second, we got to look at the skull and see what's going on there. Since he's 9 months old, I'll wait till about a year before I test some reflexes. But let's just go with that for now, and we can structurally get there. Within about 2 to 3 weeks, she started to notice he wasn't mouth breathing as much anymore, and she started noticing his tongue was starting to show like it was lifting up. By a month, she was blown away. No more breastfeeding issues. He was totally tongue up, totally keeping the mouth closed, and she saw his face, which when I show people when I'm doing cranial work, I show parents all the time. Look what you're seeing. As soon as they see it, they can never miss it anymore. And I said, now I'm going to show you how we're going to do this. And after a month, she started noticing the rotation in his skull, his forehead, his ears. She was like, I'm seeing more of a balance. His cheeks are more balanced, and I don't have any painful breastfeeding anymore. Or a little bit of he had a suckling issue. Like it was hard to create a space to create that suction, to create the seal on there. And so long story short, game changer. So it's one of those things. I have another kiddo who was getting like a tongue and lip tie release. And so usually when parents are going to get a tongue and lip tie release, my goal is to get to see them immediately right after. We can do a little bit of some adjustment before, which I usually recommend also. About a month is what I like to see. That way we know that we got the skull where we need to, because you got to think about it. A tongue and tie, if it's really needed, it's pulled and stretching. So as soon as they revise it, all of a sudden it's a snap of a rubber band, and it shifts a lot. So then structurally we got to go in and do some things. And normally what I'll see is the kid will be doing better in the first week to 2 weeks and possibly up to 3. And then we're going to start to see a remission come back, because now the body's starting to adapt to these changes. And what we ended up doing is we continue with the care. And I have one kiddo I've been working with, and mom's like, yeah, this was great. Oh my goodness, game changer. I could see him more relaxed. And then all of a sudden she's like, it's coming back. I'm seeing they're doing everything I'm supposed to do, but I'm just seeing a little bit of some tension coming back. And I said, the body's trying to adapt. We're going to work on this. Give it a couple weeks. You're going to see a different change. And within like the next week, she's like, wow, it's night and day. Like there's no tension. He is so happy now. He's smiling. I said, we're getting there. We're taking the tension off that nervous system. Remember, because you have to understand too, and this is why sometimes I may have different opinions than others. And it's just one of the things I look at things from a neurological perspective, saying, if you can hold off for release and it doesn't affect anything, and it's not affecting breastfeeding, you're working with a chiropractor who can work on making sure structurally we're keeping the tension off and so forth. It's great. You can hold off to later. And then that way there's not so much stress on that nervous system when they get the procedure. I share studies like with circumcision, where it's like, if a kid gets circumcised, they've done studies and looked at the stress levels in the blood. So it's called oxidative stress. And they evaluated these kiddos before they were going to get it. And then they had the circumcision and they watched after. I do want to make a remark on this though. They weren't getting chiropractic. So that changes the game. So what happened was they were looking to see when would their oxidative stress levels come back to normal. Some took like 5 to 10 days a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Some took a month, some took 2 to 3 months, some never did. And so that was an indicator for me, and kind of changed my perspective than where I was before with tongue and lip ties. Because then I was like, oof, that means it's going to put more stress on that nervous system and we have more work to do. Now, again, this is great to work with a pediatric chiropractor who understands this stuff, and also then have either their resources or you know someone who can evaluate and let you know, hey, you know what? And this is why working with lactation consultant, orofacial myologist, when you work with these, especially when they have tongue and lip ties, to really look and see when is it absolutely necessary and then when is it not, because that's what I care more about, is really defining that line. Because there are some people who just see it, and there's even chiropractors that'll be like, oh, they have a lip and tongue tie, you got to go get it revised. And it's just like, whoa, slowly roll down. If it's a posterior tongue tie, because a posterior tongue tie chiropractors work wonders with. Those are the ones I see the best success with, where they can hold off to later. But eventually you're going to want to get it done, but you can hold off to later, because we work really well with that. That's what I've experienced. And I've talked to other chiros, and they said the same thing. Like, yeah, posterior tongue ties, we see a little bit more, not as much tension on the body, and we can work with that. And that's what I've experienced in my own. So, but these are the things that can happen, and there's more. I have more and more stories, but I want to just give a couple there. I have another kiddo, a 5-year-old, same thing, mouth breather, tongue, not a weak tongue, and tonsils are starting to get a little bigger. And within a couple months of care, and we added some other things that we do from a neurological perspective, kiddo's tongue is in position, no more mouth breathing. They had assistance with tape. They do some mouth taping, and they stopped doing it like a month in. It was just, of course, kiddos was doing it first, and then they didn't want to do it anymore. But then parents were reporting, like, I don't notice the mouth being open anymore at night. I'll check in, I'll look, I see when, I'm taking a nap, totally good. This is kind of cool how that works. And I say, you got to go nervous system first. And then you add in the work. There's still work to do. I still recommend going to see an oral-fascial myologist. It's just like if I'm working with an infant, I still recommend go see a lactation consultant regardless if you have symptoms or not, just to make sure. To look at they'll check the suckle reflex, they'll check the palate of the mouth, they'll look and see how is it on both sides when they're pulling, how's the tongue moving, how's it that they're going to just make sure things are good. It's worth at least one visit. Totally worth it. So one of the things you can do, and I'm going to give you some tests that can help you. You can have a kiddo. It's going to be kind of hard to do this, but it's called the mirror test. And what you're doing is you're just watching them, they're watching TV, screen time, whatever that is. And can they keep the lips together for 2 minutes? Now, when I first heard this, I was like, oh my God, I always have my mouth open when I watch TV. I always have my mouth open when I played sports. So I know I was a mouth breather. This will help to know if they can hold. Nighttime red flags, just so you know. Snoring, never normal for a child, shouldn't be for adult. If they grind their teeth, not normal. This is a way the body's got that sympathetic response kicking in because of oxygen, trying to get things moving. If they're restless and they have this what's called tornado sleeping, that can be their mouth breathers, low oxygen levels. That also can be other things like there's some neurological stuff that can lead to the tornado sleeping, but that's some of it. So home support, there's mouth taping, but I recommend there's one that like helps with pushing all the lips together. So if a kid had to throw up or something, there's no holding of the lips. So it helps to retrain those muscles a little bit. Positional sleeping is great. And then tongue posture awareness, having just be aware of where their tongue is. I didn't realize in my own experience that my tongue rests on the bottom of my mouth, not on the top. Now I notice I'll be pushing right behind my teeth. So I'll just sit up there when I'm just relaxing or if I'm trying to sleep and so forth. So some concerns that I always see is like, they're not going to grow out of this, even though it's said the wait and see approach is the worst advice. So I see this in chiropractic where a patient will have some neurological stuff and they're like, Mom, I just want to wait and see. I never heard of this before. I'm just going to wait and see. Okay, but it's just going to hard condition even more. It's going to hardwire more. Same thing here. It's going to affect a lot of structural stuff when they do this. So it's always great to get this addressed. The other thing is when it comes to chiropractic care in kids, even infants, a lot of times there's a misnomer that, oh my God, I see all these videos now with adults being adjusted. That can be the chiropractic thing too. And I want to tell you that when we do adjustments, it's very subtle. It's light force. Pediatric docs do this, chiropractors that is, where we look at, it's kind of like if you close your eye and you put pressure on your eye until you can feel the pressure on your eyeball. That's the amount of pressure we use to make an adjustment on infants and kids. For me, when they're a little bigger, I start to use instruments. Again, light force. I show the kiddo what it is. And it's just, how do we just stimulate that nervous system? That's what I'm looking to do. The bigger picture of how I like to look at things is we want to look at optimal development. This is why I recommend this chiropractic as a lifestyle, because we're trying to keep your nervous system optimal. It doesn't stay there. Nothing in health stays. You have to constantly work at it no matter what. If this is a kid's nervous system to try to make sure they're adapting and evolving and brain developing the way they're supposed to, well, then you're going to have to make sure you're checking that nervous system all the time. It's not all the time, but for me, when you get to that point, it's weekly to look and see, okay, is that nervous system optimal, or is there work that we need to do to clear some stuff out to get it back there? And that's the key component. How long do you want to have your child's nervous system to be optimal? How long do you want your nervous system to be optimal? This is where we look at things from a big picture. You have to understand there's something called neuroplasticity. It's a term that's being used a lot more now, but neuros, the brain or nervous system, and plastic is change. So the younger we intervene, the younger we can help kiddos, the better we can program that brain for long-term success. And that's in chiropractic massively. My job is a lot easier when I can work with kids more. But the younger, the better, because we can set them on stage for perfect development, not perfect, but get them into optimal brain development for them. And then we can maintain that. So that way we're not trying to figure all this stuff out. When I work with kids that are 2 or 3 years old, we have a lot of work to do. And parents say they're only 3-year-old. Yeah, but 80% of the adult size of their brain is already there. Well, I'm working with a 6-month-old. Okay, we're halfway to doubling the size of the brain from when they were first born. You can see neurologically, there's a lot of changes that go on. Sooner the better. In my world, if I was a perfect world and I got to choose, I would say parents are looking to have kids in about a year to year and a half, go under chiropractic care then. Because it's going to be a game changer for the pregnancy. It's going to be a game changer for the birth process. It's going to be a game changer for when the child's born. And then when the child gets chiropractic care, we keep that nervous system in alignment so they're optimally functioning, self-regulating, self-healing, and growing and developing as the most optimal way that they were designed to. That is why I'm a pediatric chiropractor. So when you look at this, there's no fixing of your child. When we look at this from a chiropractic standpoint, doing the mouth and tongue work and so forth. This is removing the interference from a chiropractic world so that the natural body then can thrive. That is the key component of what I'm doing. So if you're in the Knoxville, Maryville, or Morristown area, and you're looking for the possibility of your child evaluated, reach out to us. Link in the bio. My website's there, wellnesspathchiro.com. You can check us out, and we'll be more than happy to take a look and see. Just let us know that you heard us from the podcast, and we will be happy to take a look and see what's going on and take you through the journey of how we look at things and so much more. Appreciate you tuning in. And as always, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss another episode. And I look forward to seeing you all on the next one.